Thank you, everybody. I hope you found that opportunity to speak to those on your table useful. Please do carry on the conversations as we move through the rest of the day. I'd like to now turn to the launch of Unseen's Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline 2025 annual assessment. Firstly, I'd like to welcome participants who are joining us online for this section of the day. For those of you online, please note that microphones and cameras will be switched off during the presentation, but please do raise any questions or concerns that you may have in the Q&A function. We will be recording this part of the event, and copies of the recording, along with the Helpline Annual Assessment Report and presentation, will be available to attendees following this event. Before we get into the figures, I just wanted to remind everyone that later this year will mark 10 years of Helpline operations at Unseen. Setting up the Helpline back in 2016 was a really tough challenge for many reasons, but one we knew would make a fundamental difference to so many. Professionals seeking help and guidance, businesses wanting to know how the new Section 54 guidance would affect them, and most importantly, those desperately seeking help to leave a situation of exploitation. As we look at these latest figures, it's important to reflect on what this day truly represents, because these are not just numbers. Behind every statistic is a person, a life shaped by exploitation, resilience, and in many cases, demonstrating real courage to seek help. Today, you will hear from two fantastic Unseen colleagues, Natasha Mitra, Head of Helpline Services, and Hilary Agg, who is our Head of Policy and Research. But firstly, I'd like to take you through a high-level overview of the Helpline and the 2025 statistics. The Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline, delivered by Unseen, is a UK-wide, confidential and independent service operating 365 days a year. It supports a wide range of service users, from potential victims and survivors to professionals and members of the public, through a person-centred, trauma-informed approach that prioritises safety, dignity and trust. With access to interpreters and multiple ways to get in touch, the Helpline ensures it's as accessible and inclusive as possible. Its collaborative model connects callers to relevant support services, while the data it gathers provides vital insight into patterns of exploitation, helping to inform stronger responses across the sector. The Helpline uses a dynamic and flexible data model designed to reflect the complexities of exploitation. It captures detailed, multi-layered information with a focus on the individual, relevant locations, and the broader situational context. This includes case-level data such as calls and contacts, individual-level insights like demographics, and task-level activities that track actions taken. It also records referrals and signposts to support services, ensuring a clear picture of outcomes and interventions. Importantly, all data is assessed and reported conservatively, prioritising accuracy and safeguarding while still providing meaningful insight to inform responses. I'd now like to show some of the high-level numbers summarising the scale of our work in 2025. As you can see, the Helpline responded to over 11,200 incoming calls, web forms and app submissions. We identified nearly 3,000 cases of modern slavery involving more than 6,500 potential victims. That's an increase of over 40% compared to the previous year, and a 37% rise in potential victims. If you put that into numbers, that's almost 900 additional cases and around 1,800 more individuals. In addition, almost 5,000 potential exploiters were recorded, representing a 40% increase on the year before. Again, in context, that's over 1,400 individuals. Overall, we made more than 15,500 referrals and signposts to external agencies and organisations, approximately 5,000 more than in the previous year. So this is not just about responding to calls and contacts, it's also about the follow-up support and advice that the whole of the Helpline team provides. But modern slavery can affect anyone, and the Helpline continues to hear from a diverse range of communities. In 2025, 93 different nationalities were identified amongst potential victims. We always take a collaborative approach, making referrals to law enforcement, government bodies and NGOs to support intelligence gathering, investigations and, most importantly, survivor safeguarding. We also advocate with first responders to enable access to the National Referral Mechanism and, where appropriate, signpost individuals to organisations that can provide more tailored support to specific needs. While modern slavery cases remain our priority focus, we also refer or signpost other types of cases where necessary. In total, we made nearly 14,000 signposts, with just under half linked to modern slavery cases. Alongside this, 1,835 referrals were submitted to partner agencies, 81% of which related to modern slavery situations. The majority of Helpline referrals are made to local and national police, over 1,200, with 75% of those going to UK law enforcement. The Metropolitan Police Service is the single largest recipient, receiving 243 referrals. In 2025, the Helpline made a strategic decision to stop referring labour abuse cases to prioritise the resources for higher risk modern slavery cases, which were on the increase. But support continues through signposting for each of these cases. In relation to the country of exploitation, we had information in relation to 2,173 modern slavery cases, with the majority, 81%, taking place here in the UK. Of these, most occurred in England, around 78%. Smaller numbers were identified in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, although each nation saw notable increases. In a further 240 cases, exploitation was reported to have taken place in the UK, but the specific nation was not identified. There were also 405 cases where exploitation occurred overseas. Of these, 94 involved both the UK and another country, leaving 311 cases that related solely to exploitation outside the UK. As you can see, this is not an issue that only happens globally. What we're seeing on the Helpline is absolutely what's happening here in the UK, and I think those statistics really show this. However, across these international cases, over half were reported in Libya, a country many people pass through after being forcibly displaced, where they are often subjected to kidnapping, labour exploitation by militia groups, frequently until a ransom is paid for their release. In terms of types of modern slavery, the Helpline applies a conservative approach to all of its data recording. Where a group of individuals is reported but the exact number isn't known, we record the minimum confirmed figure. In many cases of limited information, this is recorded as 2 people, even though there may be several more involved in a situation, though the true number could be significantly higher. Labour exploitation remains the most commonly reported form of modern slavery. In 2025, we saw a record year with a 49% increase in potential victims. These cases are often linked to legitimate businesses, highlighting how exploitation can exist within other lawful sectors. Where the type of exploitation was identified, labour exploitation accounted for 70% of potential victims, almost 4,000 individuals. Sexual exploitation represented 14% of potential victims, equating to nearly 800 people. Criminal exploitation increased by 17%, affecting 305 potential victims. Domestic servitude, whilst reported in smaller numbers, still saw a significant rise of 38%, reaching 161 potential victims. Other less common forms were also indicated, including 55 potential victims in total, 50 of whom experienced financial exploitation directly. There were 5 potential victims of organ harvesting, some of whom were also subject to other forms of exploitation. So what this data is telling us is that we are seeing all forms of exploitation being indicated to the helpline and being recorded and reported to the authorities. Overall, 360 potential victims experienced multiple forms of exploitation, with the most common combination being labour exploitation alongside domestic servitude. To provide a more detailed insight into the exploitation types we've encountered and emerging trends, I'll hand over now to Natasha Mitra, our Head of Helpline Services.
Thank you. So we captured demographic information to understand who's at risk. So where age status of potential victims was known, 90% were adults and 10% children. It's a very similar split to the previous year, but the actual numbers have shot up. So adults increased by 44%, over 3,800, and child victims by over a third, rising to 435. So that was the most we've ever recorded. Where we knew the specific age bracket, overall, it was majority was people in their 20s, and that was the most common across all types of exploitation. We've historically seen more males than females indicated, but the gaps kept reducing each year. So in 2024, females overtook males for the first time, and that was largely due to the number of migrant women being exploited in the care sector. In 2025, however, that's flipped back again. So now men and boys comprising 56%, and that followed a 62% increase in male victims. And you'll see why a little bit later on when we talk about industries, because there are quite a few increases in male-dominated sectors. So Justine mentioned 93 different potential victim nationalities that were indicated. So Indian nationals topped the list for the third consecutive year, following a 42% increase. There were more Indian potential victims indicated than the second and third most common nationalities combined. So almost 2/3 of Indian nationals were in labour exploitation. Most were in the UK on skilled worker visas in a growing range of sectors, including the care sector, hospitality, retail and construction. Vietnamese became the second most prevalent, increasing again by over a third. So Vietnamese nationals were in the top 3 in both labour exploitation and criminal exploitation. UK nationals also more than doubled, propelling into third most common. The highest numbers of UK nationals were in labour exploitation as well. Also, they were in the top 3 for sexual exploitation and second only to Albanian nationals in criminal exploitation. When we looked at child victims, UK nationals were the most indicated. There were some other large increases as well. So Somali potential victims were 11 times more common than they were the year before. So vulnerability to exploitation has increased due to the conflict surrounding Al-Shabaab, as well as forced displacement due to severe drought and flooding in the region. So Somali entered the top 10 for labour exploitation and domestic servitude, and was also in the top 10 for child victims. There was over a 1,000% increase in Sri Lankans, who also appeared in the top 20 for the first time. Again, most in labour exploitation, particularly in the retail sector, where many were on skilled worker visas. Pakistan, again, has consistently been in the top 10 since 2021, but there was a notable increase in 2025. So Pakistan featured in the top 10 for labour exploitation and sexual exploitation, and was the most prevalent nationality in domestic servitude alongside Filipinos. Brazilian nationals have been indicated in large numbers for several years, particularly in sexual exploitation, but numbers nearly doubled since 2024. They were also indicated in labour exploitation as well, predominantly in the hospitality sector, as well as being in the top 10 for criminal exploitation. And Brazilian was also the second most common nationality in relation to child victims. So almost 5,000 potential exploiters were indicated, so it averages out at about 1.7 per case or situation. In both domestic servitude and criminal exploitation, there were actually more exploiters than potential victims indicated. Where age status was known, almost all were adults, but there were 3 potential exploiters that were reportedly under the age of 18. So all 3 of them were aged 16 to 17 and were male. Where we knew gender, males comprised over 3/4, and there were also 2 trans females indicated. Female exploiters were the most common in labour exploitation, with the highest numbers in the care sector, which is actually the only industry where female exploiters were more common than men. So potential exploiters of 69 different nationalities were reported. So where we knew the nationality, the most common continued to be Libyan. That's for the 2nd consecutive year, but in even higher numbers. As Justine mentioned, Libyan exploiters are predominantly reported by potential victims who have fled from the Horn of Africa and parts of North Africa due to conflict, and then are often exploited by militia for agricultural labour. So UK nationals were the 2nd most reported, and that was following an 83% rise. Chinese was 3rd most prevalent, again, there was an increase. But the greatest variance was Somali potential exploiters, so nearly 8 times more than the 6 reported the previous year. So as I mentioned earlier, many of the Somali exploiters were affiliated with the terrorist organisation Al-Shabaab. So all of these nationalities you can see here, except for Libyan and Sudanese, are present in both the top 10 exploiter nationalities and top 10 victim nationalities. So labour exploitation comprised over half of the modern slavery cases and involved 70% of potential victims, so not far off 4,000 people. So it's the largest amount of labour exploitation the Helpline has ever recorded. The increase has been significantly fuelled by the exploitation of migrant workers on skilled worker visas, which has been snowballing since 2022. So we saw it begin in the care sector, which has now been where we've seen the most modern slavery cases for 3 years in a row. In 2025, though, the volume of cases has again escalated by almost 60%. It's no longer a problem that's unique to the care sector. It's spread into a range of other sectors, hospitality being one of them, where we've also seen a significant spike. So there's 85% more cases in hospitality than in 2024. Construction as well, slightly fewer cases, but it's actually where we indicated the highest number of potential victims, and that was after a 44% increase as well. So construction now makes up 20% of labour exploitation potential victims. So similarly to the care sector, construction is an industry where there's high demand, there's persistent labour shortages, and there's a growing reliance on cheap migrant labour, making it high-risk territory for exploitation. So in addition to this, while not modern slavery, the Helpline also receives quite a lot of calls about labour abuse, which is sort of worker rights issues without the characteristic level of control that you'd see in modern slavery. So it's the same sectors that we see there as well. So it's care, hospitality, construction and retail, which are the most prolific at the moment. So back to labour exploitation, where we knew the gender, more than 3/4 of potential victims were male, and that gender gap has broadened given the rise in construction and hospitality, where we're seeing a lot of men exploited. There was also a really steep increase in child victims, so they're over 3 times more than the year before in labour exploitation, so that was also a record high. Labour exploitation now comprises more than half of child victims, and the most common age bracket for them is 16 to 17-year-olds. So child victims were indicated in every industry that we record, apart from maritime and shipping. The most common sector, though, for children in labour exploitation was hospitality and then services. So services includes 2 very high-risk business types, so car washes and nail bars. Construction, security and retail comprise the top 5 industries where children were reported. So labour exploitation is commonly in businesses. So we often see people that have been recruited through job ads or job offers. But despite the dramatic increase in labour exploitation that we've seen, the instances of that form of recruitment have actually dropped. So something we think has contributed to that is the changes that were made to the health and care visa in July 2025, which prohibited new overseas recruitment of care workers. So what we're now seeing is a lot more cases where exploitation is beginning at the point of visa renewal. So previously, financial control had been the most recorded control method, keeping people in labour exploitation. But in 2025, most indicated was confinement or restricted movement. So that's recorded when somebody's movement is facilitated or controlled by an exploiter. So reports of that form of control nearly doubled. Financial control, tied accommodation were also reported in high numbers. So you saw earlier that Indian was the most common nationality indicated across all modern slavery cases. And really that is largely due to the numbers we're seeing in labour exploitation, which account for 91% of all Indian potential victims. So within labour exploitation, where we knew the nationality, over a quarter of potential victims were Indian. Indians were particularly prevalent in hospitality, construction, the care sector and retail. With hospitality and construction, they've now overtaken the care sector. Numbers of Vietnamese nationals increased by nearly 160%, mostly indicated in nail bars and also construction. Somali potential victims are on the list for the first time. Common sectors are construction and agriculture, but likely taking place in Somalia or Libya rather than in the UK. Pakistan, similar sectors to Indian victims, so care sector, hospitality, retail, but less so in construction. And then Sri Lanka, predominantly retail. The UK is a bit broader, but the top sector again is hospitality. Romania, it's construction and car washes. China, construction and hospitality. And Nigeria, again, mostly the care sector. And then Bangladesh is number 10, and that is a lot of people in hospitality. So moving on to sexual exploitation, these cases made up 20% of the modern slavery cases we had, with 402 reported, and that involved nearly 800 potential victims. It was actually the only form of exploitation where we didn't see a significant increase. So where age status was known, 20% of potential victims were children. So while there were higher numbers of children in labour exploitation, sexual exploitation is where we saw the largest proportion of children. So there's actually a 30% reduction in sexual exploitation, but it's still a really high proportion. The most common age bracket for child victims in this form of modern slavery, again, is 16 to 17-year-olds. As you can imagine, women and girls are heavily overrepresented here, comprising 96%. Where gender was known. It's also where the majority of transgender and gender non-conforming potential victims were indicated. The most prevalent nationality for the second year in a row has been Chinese, comprising 20%. And then we had Brazil, the UK, Romania, and Thailand completing the top 5 countries of origin. Chinese was also the top exploiter nationality, followed by Romanian and British. So the most common recruitment tactic in this form of exploitation was through false promises or statements. And then high numbers were also indicated for abduction, job offers, and familial recruitment as well. Sexual abuse was indicated across all situations of sexual exploitation. And 63% of potential victims experienced confinement or restricted movement, with tied accommodation also being indicated frequently. Criminal exploitation equated to 10% of cases and 6% of all potential victims. So 202 cases involving 305 potential victims. So it's actually a 17% increase in victim numbers on the previous year. So similarly to sexual exploitation, where we knew age status, 20% of potential victims were children. So it's these two types where the highest proportion are under 18. Criminal exploitation is also a gendered crime. So men and boys heavily overrepresented here, and that's becoming more and more apparent. So following a 28% increase in the number of males recorded, they now comprise 80% of criminal exploitation victims. The most common nationality indicated was Albanian, comprising over a quarter, but that was very closely followed by potential victims from the UK and Vietnam. The top exploiter nationalities reported were Albanian, Vietnamese, and Somali. So where we had data on recruitment tactics, coercion was the most common, and that was reported in relation to almost 30%. That was closely followed by grooming, abduction, and false promises. Confinement or restricted movement, again, was the most common control method, and that was indicated in relation to 80% of potential victims. Threats to harm the individual, their family, or somebody else were also very common, as was actual physical abuse. More than 3/4 of criminal exploitation cases relate to the drugs trade, and then much smaller numbers in relation to forced begging, theft, and fraud as well. And we've included in fraud things like benefit fraud as well as forced scamming. There were also 5 cases where people were compelled to participate in money laundering schemes, including situations of money muling, where people's accounts were used to transfer illicit funds. Domestic servitude is a particularly hidden form of modern slavery. However, we saw almost a 40% rise in potential victims of this form. So 161 potential victims across 115 cases. 80% of those in domestic servitude were female, with only 27 males indicated. Most were adults, but 12% were children. The most common age bracket amongst children was much younger than in other forms of modern slavery, with 12 and under being the most common compared to 16 to 17-year-olds in other forms. The most common nationalities here were Filipino and Pakistani. While Filipino was the most common the year before as well, numbers of Pakistani nationals have doubled. Other common nationalities were Nigerian and Indian, and the most common exploiter nationalities were Iranian, Pakistani, and Indian. While Pakistani and Indian victims were reported in high numbers, Iranian potential victims weren't. The most common way that people were recruited into domestic servitude was through a familial relationship, which accounted for over a quarter. So we actually saw reports of familial recruitment increase by almost 40%. So other common forms were through an intimate partner or marriage proposition, or false promises and statements. And then in terms of control methods and keeping people in the situation, it was tied accommodation, which was recorded in relation to all potential victims of domestic servitude as they were living on site. But other common features were confinement or restricted movement, emotional abuse, financial control, and isolation. There were 238 cases that involved a child victim. So that was a record number as well, 435 potential victims under the age of 18. So we generally have less specifics when it comes to data around children and young people because we don't speak to them directly as often. These cases are more often than not reported by professionals or members of the public. So where we did have nationality data, the most common was British, and that accounted for more than a quarter of child victims. Brazil, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Colombia made up the top 5. But the number of children of those nationalities combined was only slightly higher than the number of UK nationals recorded. The most common age bracket, as I mentioned, was 16 to 17 overall, which is actually older than the year before when it was 13 to 15-year-olds. But we saw an 86% increase in children from that older age bracket, now making up more than half of child victims. Girls were slightly more prevalent than boys. So where we knew gender, 52% were female. And that gender split really varies depending on which type of exploitation we're looking at. So the most dramatic differences were in sexual exploitation, when 90% were girls, and domestic servitude, where 2/3 were girls. Girls were also nearly 6 times more likely to have experienced multiple or various forms of modern slavery. And in contrast, criminal exploitation accounted for, where boys accounted for 80%. So the most common way that children were recruited was through a familial relationship. So where we had data on recruitment, 35% of children were recruited through a family member. So there were twice as many children recruited through a family member than through grooming, which was the second most common. So people think of online grooming, stranger danger, gangs, but a lot of this is happening in people's homes. False promises, smuggling, and abduction were also reported in similar numbers. And where control methods were known, the most prevalent was confinement or restricted movement again. So that was indicated in relation to nearly 70% of children. Where control methods really differ between child victims and overall potential victims, it's sexual abuse. So overall, 20% of potential victims experience sexual abuse, but with child victims is over 30%. So in the year that marked 10 years of the Modern Slavery Act, the Helpline recorded more modern slavery cases than ever before, and the highest number of child victims, which is a sure sign that there's more work to be done. Central government has been more preoccupied with reducing net migration than tackling human rights abuses, failing to have adequate impact on the endemic exploitation of migrant workers on health and care visas and other skilled worker visas. The alarm was raised around exploitation in the care sector back in 2022, but by 2025, the problem has been allowed to spread rapidly into other low-paid sectors reliant on cheap labour from abroad. Preventing dependents being brought to the UK, increasing minimum salaries and stopping new international recruitment in the care sector has done very little to prevent exploitation, improve regulation of sponsors, or safeguard victims. Within the care sector, we're now seeing exploitation beginning at the point of visa renewal as exploiters realise they can no longer recruit, extort and control new migrant staff. People are recruited into senior roles with high salaries in hospitality, retail and construction, only to end up in the most junior positions, experiencing abuse and being forced to return the majority of their salaries in cash, while on paper everything looks legitimate. Rhetoric around tighter border control and irregular entrants gaming the system in relation to the NRM is not backed up by any evidence and continues to be challenged by Unseen and many other NGOs. Helpline data shows that where location was known, more than 80% of the modern slavery cases reported took place in the UK. The number of British nationals in exploitation more than doubled, and the largest numbers of modern slavery victims are people brought to the UK through legitimate visa routes to plug our labour gaps. Funding cuts to essential public services have left many people without access to vital support, making them more vulnerable to exploitation. Recruitment through familial relationships has risen, and child exploitation has escalated to record levels. Modern slavery and trafficking continues to evolve as exploiters find new ways to target and control people for their profit or benefits. We're now seeing growing numbers of organ harvesting taking place in the UK and more cases related to money laundering and money muling. So these growing problems mean that demand for the helpline is escalating, and the value of this independent service can be seen now more than ever. It continues to be a lifeline for people who've experienced terrible abuses, a place for the public to report concerns, and an essential resource for professionals seeking to better support survivors. The helpline is vital in bridging the gap between the most vulnerable survivors and statutory agencies, aiding investigations and ensuring that much needed support can be accessed. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Hilary Agg, who's going to speak about how information from the helpline alongside a multi-agency approach can lead to real-world impact for survivors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tash, and good afternoon, everyone. I am really pleased to be here today to talk about the real tangible impact that the helpline has had on one area of my work, and that is partnership responses to modern slavery. So I coordinate the Southwest Anti-Slavery Partnership, and 2 years ago, I supported the development of the Bristol Modern Slavery Operational Partnership. This was a new model for the region, and it brought together frontline teams from several different agencies to generate activity that addresses those more hidden forms of exploitation, those that we've got perhaps limited information about, and that are unlikely to be addressed by law enforcement without some development. We arranged for potential situations of modern slavery that have been identified through the helpline to be referred into this partnership, where the case could then be developed using all of the information held by the various partners, and addressed with all the different tools and powers that each of these agencies have at their disposal in a really joined up, but also very much survivor-focused way. The value of these helpline referrals into the partnership has not only been the opportunity to address individual incidents of exploitation in the city. We know that awareness of modern slavery is not where it needs to be amongst many partner agencies, and with low identification rates by those partner organisations, the demonstrable prevalence of modern slavery cases identified through the helpline has really acted to generate attention to this really important issue, but also to encourage both localized and cross-border responses to modern slavery, with professionals able to develop some expertise as they're working these really complex cases. These referrals essentially are creating an evidence base that we need to advocate for investment in the modern slavery space. But it's also generating the buy-in from partner representatives as they build their understanding of modern slavery. They're starting to be able to spot the signs of exploitation through the course of their work. But having worked these cases, they're also starting to build that understanding of just how harmful an impact exploitation can have on people. The challenge we have now is that we're now starting to see more and more cases coming into this partnership, both from helpline referrals, but also from referrals in from partner representatives as well. So many so that we're starting to struggle to keep up with the volume of cases that are coming through. But having worked in this space for some time, I would rather have the data to argue for greater resource to address modern slavery than to know that it's happening all around us, but with no case for support. The period during which the partnership has been operating has been dominated, as Tash has been talking about, by this sharp rise in exploitation within the care sector. This is largely due to the introduction of the health and social care visa. And we've received 12 referrals relating to exploitation in the city that were suitable for the partnership to be addressing. And each of those referrals had indicated many people who were being exploited in each situation. These are cases that require a range of partners to be able to address effectively. Different sources are needed to really develop a fuller understanding of what's happening in the situation. Others are needed to be able to develop trauma-informed strategies for survivor engagement. And many as well, they have powers that are able to disrupt exploitation ahead of a criminal investigation. We engaged local authority housing, care commissioning teams, CQC. We involved immigration enforcement, but also the visa sponsorship teams, HMRC policing, and then of course, Unseen's first responder teams, outreach as well, amongst others. Whilst all of these cases were seeing common themes around the tied health and social care visa, things such as debt bondage resulting from really exorbitant recruitment fees, but also those threats to revoke workers' visa sponsorship. We were at the same time seeing varying models of exploitation within that. So some survivors, they had been subject to very high workloads. They were working dangerously long hours, whilst others, they'd been denied shifts, left in really, really desperate situations, unable to support themselves, but still very much unable to leave that situation. Some were being directly recruited by care providers that they were working for, where others were recruited by third parties, but then they were being controlled through debt and threats to their immigration status. Survivors, they reported that they'd been subject to threats of violence from care home directors. There'd been threats to their families as well, and some disclosed actual physical violence from their exploiters as well. Some were being housed by their exploiters, others were living independently, but they were still very much trapped. A core value of the helpline is the unique service that it can provide to victims and to survivors. You'll know that it is sometimes impossible for someone in a situation of exploitation to engage with authorities in that first interaction, and many agencies, they're not going to get that second opportunity to engage someone. But the helpline, it is there for people to reach out to at their own pace, outside of that really highly pressurized environment of an intervention. They can speak to the helpline without revealing their identity. And sometimes they can start to build trust that support is available to them if they choose it, but on their own terms, and really importantly, at a time which they know is safest. In Bristol, those survivors who were identified through the partnership's activities, but were too fearful to engage with either law enforcement or the local authority, they were provided with the helpline number, and they were able to develop some trust through the helpline and begin to engage with those agencies. They were able to access their support options and then support an investigation, which could then be allowed to progress. And I'm really confident that this would not have happened if the helpline hadn't been there as an independent, confidential, but really importantly, a person-centered service. So I can't talk too much about these cases because of the sensitivity around modern slavery situations, but I can share that as a result of these helpline referrals into the partnership, A number of people have been effectively engaged, referred into the national referral mechanism, and in fact, some of them have been supported through Unseen's frontline services. And in that, it opened up the opportunity for people to be able to engage with our Survivor Voice programme as well, informing our operational practice and improving it. And they've secured positive conclusive grounds decisions as well. Slavery and trafficking risk orders have been secured, visa sponsorship licenses have been revoked, and criminal cases have been pursued as a direct result of the helpline referrals into this partnership. I will finish by saying that the helpline is, of course, a really essential service. It's a lifeline for many people, but it also requires localized responses to be able to leverage the opportunity that the helpline provides. We need to ensure that helpline referrals are reaching the right professionals who are equipped to respond to these concerns that are raised through the helpline. We know that modern slavery is a hidden crime. Often the indicators that we see from the outside are not a lot for professionals to work with. Without survivors as well in a position to come forward and accept help, investigation is needed, and that often requires a partnership approach, but also a dedication to be able to uncover what's going on underneath the surface. The intelligence is there. That is part of what the helpline provides. But we just need to act on it. And we've seen through the Bristol partnership that we can have a real impact when we do. So I encourage you to look at where helpline referrals are coming into your local area and how they're being actioned. Are there opportunities for a more holistic partnership response to these cases that the helpline is alerting us to, especially those situations where partners can develop this information to an actionable place? And then when we're doing this, we can start to see more exploitation being fully uncovered and more survivors supported out of harm. So I'll leave it there, and I will welcome Barry to the stage, because I think Barry is going to be leading us in the Q&A sections.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hilary, and thank you to all of our presenters. So for the Q&A section, we're going to start with some questions in the room. We have Thea and Lucy here with some microphones. And after a few questions here, we'll move to some questions from our online attendees. So let's start with the room. Would anyone like to ask a question? Please put your hands up. Don't be shy.
Hi, I'm Lois. I'm from the Clue Initiative, so we collaborate a bit with the helpline on car wash reports. I was interested to hear about your sort of decision to deprioritise some of the labour abuse cases, which don't obviously meet that non-savoury concern threshold. I wondered how else you're then sort of responding to those sorts of cases, and if you're collaborating with the likes of possibly the new Fair Work Agency to respond to those cases where, you know, that's not going through your normal routes. If you can share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Labour abuse takes up, it's a really, really large proportion of cases that we receive are labour abuse and aren't in fact modern slavery. And just with the increasing demand, we had to make a decision about what we were going to focus on. So we went with what was most high risk. But we were also seeing that a lot of the labour abuse cases that we did refer weren't being actioned because the agencies that we were referring to also had the same problem, and they were having to action the most high risk stuff as well. So in those cases, most of the time we're speaking to somebody directly that's involved in the situation. So we are able to signpost and they can make contact with those agencies themselves. So they're not being left without support. We're just kind of empowering them to do it themselves.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Yes, yeah. Hi, thank you very much for this. My name is Panayota and I'm a lecturer at the University of Sheffield. I'm looking on human rights due diligence in supply chains. So I was wondering whether your research has shown which sectors in the supply chain of certain companies or which areas in the world we see more of these, I assume, labor related abuses. Thank you.
For labour exploitation, the main sectors are care sector, hospitality, construction, and retail is up there, but also services, that's got car washes and nail bars in it. So those are the top 5.
Hiya. I'm obviously at Unseen, so I know a few bits about this, but that information is continually shocking. Like, Justine's given us 3 challenges to take away, but what else can we do to help? What else can we do to change the trajectory of this information and data?
I'll go first. Thank you for that. I think it is about being curious, about not accepting what you see that's right in front of you. It's about knowing what you're seeing. Does this feel right? Because quite often that gut instinct is telling you, I need to do something about this. And when we particularly speak with our business clients, those that we work closely with, it is that professional curiosity. So whether that's a corporate client, whether that's a statutory agency, whether that's another NGO, it's actually really making sure that there is an understanding. So that awareness raising and training is so key, but it's also the what next? Because you'll always have that conversation where it's fine until we get it, till we know what's in front of us. Oh, blimey, what do we do about that? So I think it's very much around making sure that, not just policies and processes are well understood. It's getting that real key awareness, that understanding, really making sure that whatever level within, particularly an organisation, that you understand from your perspective. It is no good providing generic training to everybody, because everybody agrees and accepts that this is unacceptable. But if you don't put it into the context of understanding, what will I see? How can I deal with that? What do I do to make sure that I can report this, that I can escalate it, and that we can remediate? We're just going to keep burying our head in the sand. So it's definitely about saying, if I'm a call handler in a call centre, what do I do? If I'm working in a bank or a building society, what do I do? If I'm a supervisor on a construction site, what do I do? What does that mean for me? What do I see? How can I address it? Where can I escalate it to? And then making sure that organisations have in the round that knowledge, understanding and experience to be able to deal with that in the moment. And we know that businesses quite often will struggle with that. And that's why we partner so often with our clients, because it's about saying, right, this is about facilitating conversations, about understanding the situation, about working out what the push and pull factors are, what the vulnerabilities are that have been exploited. And then how do we work to improve those in terms of really making sure that we undertake a journey, a continuous improvement approach. So it's not a one size fits all. It's not in that moment we address it. It's how do we prevent it in the future? And how do we keep pace with those who are very adept at making money out of other people's misery?
Thank you, Justine. So we're running out of time, so let's end with one question from one of our online attendees. So William asked, would more awareness raising in transport hubs like ports, airports, train stations help combat modern slavery?
It definitely wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Justine's been talking about there, awareness is one of the key blockers to our collective response to modern slavery. But I would say that we can't just have awareness amongst the general public. I think that there needs to be standardized training available for all professionals across all of the different sectors, including the statutory agencies, and that needs to be mandatory, because you need the awareness amongst the public and the transport hubs to be able to identify, spot the signs. But then what do people do with that information? They can call the Modern Slavery Helpline, absolutely, but we're going to be referring that information most likely into a statutory agency. And the statutory agencies need to know what to do with that information. So it can't just be the general public that we're raising awareness for. It has to as well be the professionals who are working in this.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Hilary. There were more questions. We've run out of time to answer, but I will answer them before the end of the week. I'd now like to invite Justine to conclude the session. Thank you, Justine.
Thank you, and thank you to Natasha and Hilary for sharing really in-depth insight into not only the numbers behind the helpline, but also the partnerships that have been built and also the people that have been affected. I'd also like to say a big thank you to everyone that works at the helpline and in the data team as well. They have been unwavering in their dedication to supporting individuals and advising them at quite often what is their lowest point. And without their knowledge and empathy, without them building trust and being able to speak to survivors, those with lived experience, we wouldn't be able to present these numbers today. And the numbers are shocking. And this is what we've got to remember, that yes, we're talking about statistics, but we're talking about individuals at the heart of this. I would also like to thank Paula Falco, who's here today, for supporting the production of our annual assessment for the past 9 years. So please, Paula, give a wave to everybody. She has been so instrumental in supporting us to get to being able to produce and also publish the annual assessment every year. And I think when we hear back from statutory agencies and partners and businesses that they use the annual assessment as a way to better understand what's happening across the UK and beyond, I think that gives us the feedback we need to keep going. For me, I've been with Unseen for 10 years, almost to the day. And I think just thinking back this time 10 years ago, sat in an empty office, just with a number of boxes, no team, and working to try and develop a service that we hoped would be very instrumental in driving forward the response to modern slavery and really understanding what's happening on the ground. It's always a delight in one respect that we get to this point and we can share those statistics with you, but it's also recognition of the fact that we have to stand here and we have to talk about this in the 21st century, and we have to acknowledge that it is still going on, not just out there somewhere else, but amongst us, and remembering that everybody has that potential to be exploited. So it's just about remembering how we bring that in terms of both our professional lives, but also our personal lives. And I think the upward trends that Natasha mentioned through the helpline are really a stark reminder of the fact that despite supporting thousands of survivors and potential victims over those 10 years, there are still many, so many, hidden amongst us that are unseen. Too often data and lived experience are seen as very separate issues and entities, or even competing sources of insight. But in reality, they're very much interconnected. Data gives us scale, patterns and trends. Lived experience gives us depth, context, and meaning that genuinely shines a light on this issue. Without data, we really risk missing the bigger picture, and without lived experience, we risk misunderstanding it. Through the helpline, we can show how powerful it is when these two things come together, when real experiences inform the data, and the data in turn drives better responses. And that's when we can create insight that's truly shaped by real lives. Thank you very much.